Disney, specifically Walt Disney Animation Studios, is a studio I have a particularly complicated relationship with. Sometimes they're responsible for stunning works of art that touch the hearts of many, myself included, cementing their place as a staple name in animation. Other times, however, man can they be frustrating. They have all the money in the world, yet it often feels like they do the bare minimum. Today, that feeling is more apparent than ever, as pretty much every other studio is taking visual and narrative risks, while Disney, one of the medium's pioneers, settles for mediocre trite enjoyable by only small children. They may have had glory days in the 2010s, but those days are long gone. And as the critical and box office reception of their works continues to plummet, their future gets progressively darker and darker. Today, I'm gonna explain why the current flop era of Disney might be their worst yet, and that I don't see how they could possibly return from this in the future. About a year and a half ago, my good friend Emoji Movie Channel made a video explaining why he was concerned about the future of the studio, and since then, things have only gotten worse. A few of the points I make in this video come directly from his video, so check it out if you want to see them in more detail. Anyway, this is far from the first slump Disney's been in. They were in a big one for many years after Walt died, struggling to find the spark that made them successful in the past. As we all know, they found that spark and returned bigger than ever with their renaissance around the 90s. Then they got into another slump in the 2000s during the rise of CG animation, before striking gold again in the 2010s, or their revival era as some call it. This is probably when Disney animation was at its most financially successful, and for good reason. Most of the movies they put out for most of that decade were really good. Not all of them were, since I don't like Frozen at all, and Big Hero 6 is also pretty damn flawed, insert his mistake here. Aside from those sorta duds, Tangled, Wreck-It Ralph, Zootopia, and Moana are all great. They're fun, funny, gorgeously animated, full of heart, and in the cases of Tangled and Moana, topped off with a bunch of catchy musical numbers. They're the kinds of animated features enjoyable by all ages, and I, like many others, still love them a decade later. Things were going very well for the studio, but then everything changed when Ralph Breaks the Internet attacked. While this quote-unquote movie did very well at the box office and initially received well critically when it first released in late 2018, everyone who wasn't a paid shill quickly realized, wow, this is garbage. It is literally just the Disney brand Emoji Movie that also happens to destroy everything about a movie I love as a bonus. It is without a doubt my most hated film from the studio, but I'm not gonna waste time ripping it apart since the rest of the internet has already done that for me, and rightfully so. A year later, the studio followed it up with Frozen 2. It had the potential to be really good, but a rushed production forced on the studio by corporate meddling squandered it all. The plot loses any and all structure midway through, half its cast is given nothing to do, it has plot holes and deus ex machinas out the ass, it ends in a way that doesn't leave any impact on the viewer. I could go on. TLDR, this movie's a mess. I still like it more than the first, I'm sorry. To be fair, these movies were sequels made for money. Not only are Disney published movies made only for money rarely, if ever, good, but the company also has an infamously bad track record with sequels. I mean, just look at their straight-to-DVD output. Luckily, their next film on the horizon was an original work, Raya and the Last Dragon. I was looking forward to this for a while leading up to its release. From the trailers, it had an interesting looking world, badass looking action, and a seemingly more serious tone than the studio's other works at the time, at least when Awkwafina kept her mouth shut. And when it finally came out in early 2021, it sucked. Its world is wasted on a painfully generic fetch quest storyline. Its dialogue is cringe-inducing and loaded with bad MCU humor. Its characters are boring, annoying, or useless. It has, hands down, the worst villain in any Disney movie, and not only is its message about trust constantly blurted into the viewer's face, but it also heavily clashes with the story to the point where its presentation can actually be considered harmful. Man, what a waste of potential. Thankfully, Disney also put out Encanto later that year. This movie is very different from others the studios put out around this time, for one simple reason. It's actually good. Its characters are charming, funny, compelling, and memorable. Its more limited scope allows its plot to breathe without having to haphazardly shift locations every 10 minutes. It has an engaging family conflict with actual nuance without beating you over the head with its themes, and it's also topped off with some great song numbers. After 3 disappointments in a row, Encanto was the movie that made people remember, oh yeah, Disney is actually a talented studio. But, and this is a big but I am not gonna act like this current age of Disney is good just because Encanto was good. I despise Pocahontas with every fiber of my being, but that doesn't mean I'm gonna call the Renaissance as a whole a bad era for Disney just because of that one movie. It was the exception to that era, and Encanto is the exception to this era. Judging from that, you can probably guess that Disney did not stay on the hype train for their 2022 release. And you, my viewer, are absolutely right. I think there are more people who know about how badly Strange World performed in the box office than there are people people who have actually seen it. There was barely any marketing, and the little marketing it did get made it look really bad. And when it came out, it was really bad. I didn't even bother watching it until I had to go gather data for this video. That's how little I cared. It has some interesting concepts and a visually creative world, but that matters little when it also has such an uninspired, tepid story and cast of characters. There's a genuinely good message about environmental damage hidden deep within, but I'm not able to care about it since they throw this in your face in the last 20 minutes after spending over an hour on such an asinine depiction of generational trauma. That covers the 4 disappointments out when Emoji made his video, and since then, Disney Animation has released one more feature film. The big celebration of their 100-year history. Wish. I was honestly really looking forward to this movie. It had a simple premise and limited scope, sure, but if their last 3 movies were anything to go by, I was sure they'd find a way to make it work. It also helps that it was going to be a musical, it was stated to have a more distinct art style than their other recent works, and it was going to feature an actual villain! Finally! Despite its less than stellar first look and increasingly negative press leading up to release, I still held on to a thin layer of hope that it would be good. I mean, this is a simple premise that could wind up being thematically powerful. It's a musical, and Disney musicals almost always have good songs. Most importantly, this is their centennial. There's no way they could f this up. They f***ed it up. Wish, at least for me, was the straw that broke the camel's back. It takes every problem I've had with Disney's recent works and doubles down on them. It does nothing interesting with its premise, instead opting to lazily slap together a bunch of cliches from past movies to make a painfully generic kids movie. It spends so much time making references to previous movies that it forgets to leave any lasting impression on its own merits. For instance, Asha's friend group is based on the Seven Dwarfs. That's a cute nod to Disney's first feature-length film. Too bad there's nothing to these characters beyond that reference. And of course, there's the ending. Instead of giving its own story a proper resolution, the movie wastes time jerking the studio off with non-stop hollow references to its other, better movies. They're not even subtle about it either. They straight up jingle them in front of you like keys in front of a baby. Oh, but the animation is stylized. They literally just placed a shitty cell shading filter on the 3D models and plastered them on admittedly pretty looking 2D backgrounds and called it a day. It's nowhere near the same ballpark as Spider-Verse. If anything, it feels like they purposefully cut corners and just use art style as an excuse, thinking the animation is cinema crowd would eat it up anyways. But the villain, there's a real villain again. And he sucks. He actually feels morally in the right early on, with how the conflict is presented. Then they lazily turn him into a generic evil wizard using a Deus Ex Machina evil book just to make Asha look like the good guy and to appease the crowd who've been waiting for a new Disney villain. We wanted a good new Disney villain. Thank you very much. But the songs, Disney never messes up the songs. They usually don't, but this time, oh boy, did they. They're the most trite pop songs imaginable, with instrumentals and lyrics that don't flow well together at all. None of them are catchy, charming, or memorable in the slightest. If word got out that AI was used to write these so-called songs, I honestly wouldn't be surprised. This movie desperately wants to recapture Disney's old magic and be loved, while doing nothing to warrant any of that in the first place. It is the definition of a desperate corporate product, and the more I think about it, the more I hate it. Emoji Movie Channel is currently working on an entire essay about why this movie doesn't work, so see it when it comes out for more details. So that's modern Disney's current lineup. Talk about disappointing. There's one good movie, and the rest are either mediocre or utter garbage. They're not even impressive failures for unique reasons either. They all have strikingly similar flaws. Emoji already covered some of these in his video, so I'll quickly go over them for the next few lines. Number 1, the side characters are shoved aside and given nothing to do. You could cut most of the cast from these scripts and little would change. Number 2, the pacing is way too fast and leaves little room for the characters and audience to breathe. Number 3, they have creative world building, but they waste it on the most uninspired scripts out there. And number 4, the messages are horribly mishandled and often clash with the actual plots of these movies. He, of course, went a lot more in-depth with these in his video, but I have a few issues I've seen in modern Disney movies that I'd like to discuss as well.
Number 5. Predictable humor.
This one's kinda hard for me to explain, since comedy is subjective and all that, but these movies all tend to have the same sense of humor, and I honestly don't find it funny. Witty jokes like these worked really well in Tangled, but that was over 13 years ago. Now it feels very formulaic, predictable, and forced. I don't really know what else to say, just know that everything wrong with modern Disney's humor is embodied by that f***ing goat!
Number 6. Formulaic animation.
To be fair, the animation in current Disney movies isn't bad, far from it depending on the movie. But for the biggest studio in the business, I should expect them to do something at least a bit more visually creative than the Tangled art style again. Realistic looking CG animation has kind of lost its luster for me. It peaked in 2019 for me with the likes of How to Train Your Dragon 3 and Toy Story 4. But since then, not much in this style has really wowed me, since these movies have kind of hit the limits of realistic graphics. With stylized CG, on the other hand, there are no limits. limits. The Spider-Verse movies, The Mitchells vs. the Machines, Puss in Boots 2, Nimona, Mutant Mayhem, and many others are all visually distinct from each other on top of being insanely well animated, proving that there are no limits to CG animation if you just put your mind to it. Meanwhile, Disney keeps doing realistic environments with samey looking character designs and movements on top, and their one attempt at quote-unquote stylization was so half-assed it's like saying Sonic Team tried with forces. Remember back in Disney's hand-drawn movies when the characters' designs and movements had personality and proportions that matched with the characters in question? Now, pretty much every character moves the same way, and the designs also look pretty samey. There are only so many times I can look at the same Elsa face before joining C's. They even managed to plaster that face onto a dragon, for crying out loud. Strange World was at least onto something with the slightly more expressive designs of its three leads, but it still loses points for everyone else using the generic same face style anyway.
Number 7. Telling over showing.
This kind of ties into Emoji's fourth point about modern Disney movies, but I think it extends into a greater issue. These recent movies do not let the audience process the events on their own, and instead feel the need to spell everything out for them. I can name at least one example from all 5 of these movies. In Ralph Breaks the Internet, Ralph straight up states the message of the movie out loud.
From up here, I can see how I do come across as needy and clingy and self-destructive, like Knowsmore said.
Moving on to Frozen 2, since I never want to think about Wreck-It Ralph 2 again, this movie has the underlying plot device of 4 elemental spirits with a 5th spirit in the center connecting them all. It's never really elaborated on until the end when Anna just tells Elsa she's the 5th spirit. Okay, I probably missed something, but I don't know. I haven't seen this movie in like 4 years. In Raya and the Last Dragon, every other minute, Awkwafina feels the need to yell in Raya's face, "Why do you not trust people?" Even though she has very good reasons to not trust people. Honestly, this movie as a whole would have been way more tolerable if they just dropped this embarrassing message entirely. Anyway, spoiler warning for Strange World if you care that much. After the titular Strange World is revealed to be the innards of a titan everyone's been living on, they spell all the previous foreshadowing out for the audience to make it clear if it wasn't already. Then Ethan just claims to his dad that the Pando energy is killing the Titan because environment message. Could you have at least bothered to show the energy visibly harming the creature rather than having Ethan just spell it out? Then we get to my personal favorite example, in Wish. I'll just let it speak for itself.
The queen looks scared.
You don't say!
It's a damn shame because so many previous Disney movies were great at showing overtelling. My personal favorite film from Disney animation is Mulan, which excels at this. Rather than yelling in your face how badass Mulan is by giving her superpowers or some shit, which they probably do if this movie released today, they show her struggle to improve as a soldier, person, and hero through her actions far more than her words. Film is a visual medium after all, and actions speak far louder than words. There are so many examples from other older Disney movies I could list off, but I haven't got all day. Just know that the older movies respected the audience's intelligence and that the current ones do not. That's essentially the majority of modern Disney's problems. They're uninspired, repetitive, poorly written, they talk down to their audience, and they rely solely on the Disney name to gain traction. Instead of feeling like works of art someone wanted to add to the world, they feel like they had to be forced out to make their yearly quota. As inconsistent as Pixar's recent output has been, at least their movies still feel like they have passionate artists at the helm. For the most part, at least. If these movies had any passion put into them, it must have been cut down by executives to make them more easily digestible for the youngest kids. Everyone knows how much Frozen 2 was butchered by executive meddling, but Wish is also a likely victim of this. The concept art shows so many scrapped ideas that look so much more interesting than what we got in the final product. If that wasn't enough, the execs made the brilliant decision to remove a song sung by Asha's grandfather, despite it being a key part in their motivations and just generally being a good song and use of this movie's theming. Were you trying to sabotage this movie or something? This brand of mediocrity worked for them for a while, but not anymore. In the mid to late 2010s, almost anything the Walt Disney Company released was bound to be a critical and financial hit. They could seriously release the second worst movie of all time and it would still make bank and get a slap on the wrist at worst from critics due to the brands attached to it. But we're not in the 2010s anymore, and people are finally removing the rose-tinted glasses and realizing that Disney is just pushing out lazy products that rely solely on brand recognition. And as such, more of their products are bombing, including their animated features. It's gotten to the point where a lot of their movies aren't even doing well critically. Audiences are finally willing to call Disney-published movies bad, aside from the few actually good ones. That is simultaneously cathartic and depressing. It's cathartic because the pride and ego Disney gained in the previous decade has come back to bite them, since more and more people are finally realizing how shitty their products have been as of late. But it's also depressing because despite everything, I still want this studio, not the company, the studio, to succeed. Despite all its ups and downs, Walt Disney Animation Studios has made impacts all around the world. It's hard to imagine where animation or pop culture would be without it, and to see them submit to mediocrity and pay the price for it is just painful. And I hate to say it, but this dark age of Disney doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. The next 4 movies they have in the works are all sequels to some of their revival era films. 1 to Moana, 1 to Zootopia, and 2 more to Frozen. It's the same problem Pixar faced in the 2010s, which still lingers. Moana 2, which is set to release later this year, is a special case. It was originally going to be a Disney Plus sequel series, but they reworked it into a full theatrical movie to fill their slot for this year because that worked so well before. Its announcement as a feature film in early February came straight out of nowhere, and since it hasn't been too long since Wish bombed, Lynn's not returning to write the new songs, and Cravalho and The Rock have yet to return to their roles, this entire move reeks of desperation. The Zootopia and Frozen sequels aren't off the hook either, since they were announced not too long after Strange World bombed. Oh, but this is your fault for not supporting their original movies. Shut the f up. Nobody saw Strange World or Wish because they looked bad from the trailers and were bad. If Disney Animation wants to stay afloat, they need to create good original movies that resonate with people, not reminding everyone of how much better they once were half the time and spending the other half producing slop you'll forget in a day. They're not capable of letting go of the past. They're too scared to take any risks. Everything they make has to either be safe and sanitized for young kids, have connections to previous better works, or both. They're only making so many sequels out of the blue to remind audiences that they're the studio behind their superior predecessors after multiple original duds, likely not caring if the end products end up being good. This is what Disney is now, where creativity and artistic merit go to die. And if this pride and desperation continues past this incoming wave of cash-in sequels, I don't see how they could stay up and running without theme park funding. It's so sad that one of animation's pioneers has been stooping this low as of late. But I guess that's just how the world is now.